passport control, first floor, to the back departure lounge.
For passengers Bailey, Gill and Alfred, please go immediately to gate 53, where the flight is now closing.
This is the brink of the old world, the furthest point west on the mainland of Ireland. Over there, across 2,000 miles of very cold water and some of the worst weather to be found anywhere, is North America. It's said that St. Brendan, the navigator, sailed from here to the New World 900 years before Columbus. Well, that was an act of faith, if you like. But so it was to cross that angry stretch of water by air 60 years ago. But it was the conquest of the Atlantic, with all the technical advances, the business and the national rivalries involved, and the endless search for the right aircraft, that set the course for the future of civil aviation.
London ground to Clipper 101 at Lima 35 for startup.
Flight 101 is on its way from London to New York.
Clipper 101, Roger, you're clear to start. Your clearance is a Brecon 28 to Kennedy, squawk 5762. Clipper 101, Brecon 28 to John F. Kennedy, 5762.
This is just one of over 370 passenger planes that cross the Atlantic on a busy day.
%. 50%. Valves closed.
Clipper 101, taxi, please. Fine.
Clipper 101, turn left on the outer taxiway for 28 left. Give way to the Speedbird 747. Be coming onto the inner taxiway.
44 airlines now fly the Atlantic. The 400 passengers on board this jumbo think nothing of the 3,500-mile journey ahead of them. The worst thing likely to happen, apart from delay due to the overcrowded skies, is that they've seen the movie before.
Canadian Military 3829, cut across straight left now, right turn on the outer.
3829 is moving. Turn number 3.
Clipper 101, clear for takeoff.
101 roll.
Clipper 101 and 112, contact 132.8.
Good day, Clipper 101.
101, the speed restriction climb to 6,000 feet.
6,000, no speed, thank you.
Crossing the North Atlantic is now the safest long-distance air route in the world, but it wasn't always so. Far below is one of the great barriers that divide the world. Driven on by hope and greed and daring, Sailing ships were pushed to the limits of what wind power could do. Human cargoes grasping for a new life in the New World provided the stimulus for bigger and faster steamships. Until before the First World War, luxury liners were carrying wealthy business passengers across the Atlantic in 5 or 6 days of comfort and safety, and making good profits for their owners. How could aviators possibly compete with this arrogant splendor? It must have seemed like madness with the aircraft and the rudimentary aids that existed 60 years ago. If the pilot climbed above bad weather into the less dense atmosphere, he faced oxygen starvation and unconsciousness. And since temperature drops 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 300 feet climbed, he'd soon be half frozen in his open cockpit. Yet in 1919, all kinds of adventurous flyers were hell-bent on winning the £10,000 prize that the Daily Mail newspaper had offered for the first man to fly non-stop across the Atlantic. As their starting point, they chose Newfoundland, because from there to Ireland was the shortest crossing. And flying from west to east, they'd be helped by the prevailing winds. Many crashed into the sea. The first to make it in one piece was an American, Lieutenant Commander Reed, in a flying boat. He was supported by 68 US Navy destroyers every 50 miles along the route. He made stops in the Azores and Lisbon, and finally reached Plymouth after 23 days. But just a few weeks later, 2 ex-Royal Flying Corps airmen prepared for takeoff from St. John's, Newfoundland. Captain John Alcock, the rather jaunty British pilot, and his sulphur-facing navigator, Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown, born an American citizen. Their World War I Vickers Vimy bomber, laden down with fuel, laboriously lurched off from a hillside. There is, of course, no actual film of the flight, but this replica gives an idea of the flimsy, fabric-covered craft in which they faced 2,000 hazardous miles. Almost at once, their wireless set broke down. They flew blind through fog, endured fierce rainstorms, hail and turbulence. Imagine Brown climbing out of his cockpit onto that frail wing again and again to clear ice from the petrol flow gauge. Over 16 hours later, they saw land, the hills of Connemara, Ireland. It was 8:15 a.m. on Sunday morning, June the 15th. Alana Bent, then a little girl, was on her way to church.
We heard the plane, and then we saw it coming in over Clifton Castle. It circled round the town, and then it came out here, circled round, firing very lights, and landed.
They'd crash-landed in a bog. Freddie Teague ran down from the nearby Marconi wireless station.
We chased across the bog, and Brown was limping about outside the plane. He was lame in one leg, but Alcock was still in the cockpit and was throwing out little items. He threw out a packet with 2 cigarettes in and said, "All the way from Newfoundland." Brown was quite quiet. He had very little to say, but Alcock was continuously speaking. Like when he threw the stuff out, he was saying, "Who'll have this, who'll have the other?"
Alcock and Brown had made the first non-stop transatlantic flight. The prize was theirs, presented to them by Winston Churchill, and King George V knighted them both. In this unlikely way, the race began to run the first commercial air service over the most prestigious passenger route in the world. Within 2 weeks, another contender had entered the field. A British airship, the R-34, flew the Atlantic from Scotland to New York and back again. It was a fantastic, unsung achievement. For the men who made the first Atlantic round trip, there was little acclaim. Sensing this, perhaps, they dropped their water ballast on the band playing them in at Fulham Airfield. The Battle of the Atlantic between the airships, the aeroplanes and the great liners was on. Yet it was over 5 years before another aircraft made the crossing, and a regular service for passengers was still inconceivable.
flight with us. Present time, we're at 31,000 feet. Our position is over Strumble Head on the Welsh coast. And very shortly we'll be crossing St. George's Channel, over at Cork in the southern portion of Ireland. And from which point we will commence our ocean crossing at the 50th parallel.
Back in the 1920s, no one had yet flown non-stop between New York and Paris. But a new prize stimulated several attempts at this more ambitious journey. And again, lives were lost. Until a small, specially built plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, its fuselage one enormous fuel tank, left Roosevelt Field, New York. Its lone pilot, characteristically, had made painstaking preparations. A quiet, shy, 25-year-old American, Charles Lindbergh. 33 and a half hours later, on May the 21st, 1927, he arrived in Paris. The first solo, non-stop Atlantic crossing produced a worldwide emotional response equaled only by the first men on the moon. Lindbergh had flown 3,610 miles, far longer than Alcock and Brown's record, and he'd done it alone. The Atlantic was now a matter of national pride. First across from west to east against the prevailing wind. The Germans, Kohl and von Hunefeld, with Fitzmaurice from Ireland. First by flying boat, von Gronau. The first solo woman, Amelia Earhart. First solo east to west, Jim Mollison. And Balbo, the fascist Italian air minister, flying Mussolini's air armadas across in formation. But still no commercial plane existed that could stay in the air long enough to fly that 2,000 miles in winter, let alone regularly in each direction or with passengers. It was left to the airships and Germany to provide the world's first commercial air service across the Atlantic. Between 1930 and 1937, the Graf Zeppelin made 147 trips between Germany and Brazil over the South Atlantic, where the weather was usually better. It became the first aircraft to fly over 1 million miles. It carried 13,000 people in great comfort and safety. It was a luxury ocean liner in the sky for 50 passengers, a vast payload then. It was generally agreed that the airships would operate all the long-distance routes of the future, and that the aeroplane would never be a very suitable vehicle for competing with the liners in carrying passengers across oceans. To counter this, German aeroplane designers produced the extraordinary Dornier Doex flying boat, powered by 12 engines. It contained a restaurant come dancing salon, a bar and cabins for 150 passengers. But its 12 engines were thirsty, and an accident-packed journey to New York in 1929 only gave the newsreels a good laugh.
Well, shiver my timbers if the Doex isn't here at last. For months, everybody has been on the lookout for this huge flying boat. Since leaving Switzerland, where they gave her a hearty yodel, the seaplane has carried hard luck as a passenger. In Lisbon, a wing was burnt off. In the Canary Islands, a wild wave smacked her in the nose. In Balama, Africa, an overload prevented a takeoff. And in South America, a cracked crankcase laid her up. Otherwise, she was okay all the time. However, we should let bygones be bygones, for the big craft certainly crossed the Atlantic. And here is her gallant crew, undaunted by the delays which marked the trip. They have faith in the Doex. And why shouldn't they? They got here in 10 months, just 3 times as long as it took Columbus.
In England, the British Imperial airship program had produced 2 huge airships to link the empire. The successful R100 built by private enterprise and the government-backed R101. The R101 was not a good ship. She was overweight and underpowered even when she was sliced in half and an extra gas bag was inserted. She should never have flown, but she did. Lord Thompson of Cardington saw to that. He was an ambitious politician who wanted to make a spectacular arrival in India in the airship that he had backed. The R101, he had said himself, was safe as a house except for the millionth chance. Taking out extra insurance cover for himself, he ordered that chance to be taken. On Saturday, October the 4th, 1930, in spite of leaking gas bags, faulty valves, lack of lift, lack of power, an exhausted crew and worsening weather, His Majesty's airship R101 cast off for France and India. As she disappeared in storm clouds over England, the Air Minister, the Director of Civil Aviation, the Director of Airship Development, and most of the leading airshipmen of Great Britain sat down to their last supper. 200 miles later, R101 crashed into a hillside outside Beauvais. All but 6 of the crew and passengers lay dead inside the sprawling length of the smoking wreck. The British airship program was cancelled. The successful R100 was knocked to pieces and sold as scrap, causing a bitterness that lasted a generation. But out of the disaster, a boost had been given to the aeroplane.
John McLean's Ripper 101 to Kennedy on track Foxtrot, maintain flight level 340, Mach decimal 84 from 53 north, 15 west, go ahead.
Okay, clear to John F. Kennedy via Foxtrot, maintain 340 from 53 north and 15 west, Clipper 101.
Most passengers on today's transatlantic giants, placidly awaiting their meal, are quite unaware that beneath them on the same plane are up to 22 tons of cargo, including mail. And it was mail that was the bread and butter of the airlines in the past, allowing them to pioneer their passenger services. In 1934, Lufthansa opened up an ingenious airmail service over the South Atlantic to Brazil. From Germany, the mail was flown to West Africa, the first lap of the relay. Then transferred to Dornier flying boats and carried over the ocean to a depot ship stationed beyond the Azores. Once the ship and the Dornier had located each other, the flying boat would land and taxi onto a canvas apron dragged behind the ship. After being hoisted on board, it was serviced and refueled for the next stage of the journey. Then came the tour de force. The seaplane was literally fired down a 110-foot ramp, 20 years before the navies used steam catapults for launching at sea. Using this for mail and airships for passengers, Germany was forging ahead in the race for a commercial service. And during 1936, Hitler's Hindenburg joined Graf Zeppelin along the Atlantic air routes. She was even more magnificent than her predecessor, designed specifically for transocean service. Only a little smaller than the liner Queen Mary, she embraced everything the Germans had learned about dirigibles. In luxury, she was unmatched. But of course, the passengers were sitting inside a bomb. Her gas bags were filled not with safe helium, but with hydrogen. Hitler was in power, and America refused to supply Germany with helium. So into the biggest aircraft ever built went inflammable, explosive hydrogen. On the 6th of May, 1937, after an enjoyable flight, Hindenburg appeared as usual over the skyscrapers of Manhattan. There had been an electrical storm. And what happened in a few now famous nightmare minutes completely altered the course of Atlantic air history.
It's just the time for dancing. Tomorrow is today.
No passenger airship ever flew again. The great ocean liners continued to reign over the Atlantic with only tiny aeroplanes for competition. They were so confident that they gave generous help with radio bearings and weather reports to the crazy flyers above their heads, never dreaming that they were assisting in their own destruction. And business was booming. But the shipping lines did recognize the importance of speed, and within the limits of what was possible, they strove to cut the journey time across the Atlantic. Cunard's Queen Mary was prominent in the struggle to win the coveted blue ribbon for the fastest crossing.
Are you going to try for the blue ribbon, Captain?
Well, naturally, that's what we're out for. What did we build her for?
Transatlantic flying services are on the way. In the spring of next year, Imperial Airways hope to make experimental flights across the Atlantic to America, and so their most experienced pilots are undergoing a special course at Hamburg.
Confidence was growing, and the airlines, unlike the shipping companies, were helping each other. Charles Lindbergh, the solo Atlantic flyer, had put his unique experience at the disposal of Pan American Airways. Pan Am's founder, Juan Trippe, saw the Atlantic through a businessman's eyes. In 1936, at a high-powered picnic in Ireland, he got together with Britain's Imperial Airways. For their usual political reasons, the British were more interested in their empire routes. Yet they agreed with Pan Am to endorse Shannon, then an Irish marsh, as the site of a future landplane aerodrome for an Atlantic service. Both insisted that neither should start such a service before the other. Across the river from Shannon, Foynes became the seaplane base, and from here on the 5th of July 1937, President De Valera of Ireland saw Captain Wilcoxon of Imperial Airways set off on a proving flight across the Atlantic. It was raining. Britain's only viable aircraft with which to show the flag was an Empire flying boat, stripped to the bone and stuffed with fuel. Navigation still relied on the sun and stars, if visible, and radio assistance from ships. At the same agreed moment, one of Pan Am's old Sikorsky flying boats had taken off from Long Island, New York. Captain Gray and his Pan Am crew landed at Foynes the next day. And this is where they came ashore. It's hard to imagine that 40 years ago, this little town of Foynes was really seen as a threat to the great passenger terminals like Liverpool and Southampton. But it was, and at long last, the shipping companies woke up to the idea that competition was looming. A Marine Commission reported gloomily, and I quote, "Large flying boats carrying up to 150 passengers may well supersede highly expensive superliners of the Queen Mary and Normandy class," which seems unduly pessimistic at a time when to fly the Atlantic at all with a full payload and in bad weather was still a major problem. There were several ingenious attempts to extend the range of existing aircraft, such as refueling in flight. A tanker plane rendezvoused with the flying boat a short way out from Foynes, and again before Newfoundland. The process was done with great accuracy and proved commercially possible, but there were difficulties in bad weather. And if you think the space shuttle is breaking new ground, look at this. A piggyback plane. The small, fully loaded seaplane on top used the flying boat's engine power for the long takeoff. The fuel saved allowed the seaplane, loaded with mail, to carry on across the Atlantic once it had detached itself from Big Brother. But while the British were struggling with stopgap devices, there were rumours of an American plane that could carry not only mail but passengers across in liner luxury.
Let's revert to the Roosevelt family. The president's wife has a delicate touch.
This was definitely the first Atlantic commercial plane, the Boeing B-314. And Juan Tripp of Pan Am naturally wanted to operate it as soon as possible. His gentleman's agreement with the British soon faded away. On May the 20th, 1939, the 12th anniversary of Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic, Pan Am's new Yankee Clipper began the first regular transatlantic commercial service. The Boeing flying boat carried a crew of 13 and over 30 passengers. But spacious though it was, those first Atlantic flights could easily become more of an endurance test than these pictures might suggest. With strong headwinds, the crossing could take up to 29 hours. At journey's end, what with air sickness, fatigue and cold, passengers were in desperate need of a pick-me-up. And at Foynes in Ireland, a special drink was created for them, one that was distinctively Irish and would appeal to the American taste, an unusual byproduct of transatlantic flying, now known throughout the world as Irish coffee.
There's some sugar at the bottom of the glass, all according to how you fancy it. And then you pour in some whiskey, but I let you put in the whiskey. You know your own taste in whiskey. It's as well to cover the sugar.
That's a matter of taste.
It's a matter of taste, actually. And then finally the coffee.
Which should be nice and hot, presumably.
It is lovely. The semi-whipped cream.
Thick.
But such aids to recovery were no substitute for the right aircraft. In Germany, the successful flight of an all-metal land plane, the Focke-Wulf Condor, from Berlin to New York and back again, had pointed away from flying boats as the ultimate Atlantic passenger vehicle. A trend that was hastened by other events. With the outbreak of war, governments poured unlimited money into aircraft research and development. By the time the fighting ended, great technical advances had been made, and thousands of ordinary people had had their first experience of flying, creating a market that the airlines were able to build on in the years to come. Now, 83,000 people are fed over the Atlantic in one day. But before the plane makers or the airlines were able to operate on anything like this scale, they still had a long way to go. and at first the result was some enormous white elephants. In the United States, Howard Hughes' Spruce Goose was so big that a firm of house movers had to be called in to haul it to the sea in bits. Its wingspan was longer than a football pitch, its tail as tall as a 5-story building. And yet, the largest airplane ever built was made of plywood. Just as carrying mails stimulated aircraft development in the 30s, it was transporting troops that inspired this and many of the aircraft designs that followed. But not a single soldier did the Spruce Goose ever carry. It was flown just once, by Hughes himself in 1947. And for all its impressive size, the 200-ton monster barely managed to lift off the water. Another one-off destined for the scrap heap was Britain's Bristol Brabazon, but it too was overpriced, underpowered and overtaken. The Saunders Row Princess flying boat was also too late. By the time it flew, the world's airlines had switched irrevocably to land planes. But at first, passengers had to make do with converted bombers. The Super Fortress became the Boeing Stratocruiser, transformed to carry 55 or more passengers in great comfort. Its best remembered feature was a spiral staircase leading to a bar and lower deck lounge. The Stratocruiser was really the last fling of pre-war luxury set by the flying boats. There were magnificent dressing rooms for both men and women. Fitted up as a sleeper, it had 28 beds. On the ground, airports were beginning to suggest the frantic nature of things to come. The airlines began to woo ever-increasing numbers of transatlantic passengers away from the shipping companies. Air services proliferated, but often with ground facilities that were almost non-existent. At London's Heathrow, BOAC made do with tents until a new terminal was ready. Heathrow was one of many airports that grew up as the world's airline network took shape. Airport planning and architecture has changed our environment in the past few decades as much as the great railway building boom transformed our surroundings a century ago. Just as railway stations stimulated development in the city centres, the siting of airports in the outer suburbs for reasons of cost, noise and pollution has contributed to urban sprawl and the decay of inner cities, particularly in the United States. No traffic jams yet. In fact, there was an urgent need to fill all this new capacity on the ground and in the air. The shiny concrete palaces were dreamily uncrowded, and the airlines had to work out how to change that. They finally lighted on something that they've recently rediscovered, namely that lower prices lead to higher demand. In 1952, they introduced the first economy fares, and it began to work. By 1958, the number of passengers crossing the Atlantic by air exceeded for the first time those crossing by sea. It was the writing on the wall for the ocean liners. The final blow was the arrival of the jets, which were soon to wipe out all opposition and become virtually the only form of transatlantic travel. The Boeing 707 was the first of a generation of jets that have become the most successful flying machines ever made. But before they conquered the world, the industry had suffered one of its tragic setbacks. The first jet airliner had been the British Comet. In 1952, it was a step into the unknown, and its success was short-lived. 3 broke up in the air. The investigation that followed was the most thorough and expensive that had ever been undertaken, and it set standards that helped to make air transport very much safer. it disclosed the cause of the comet crash, metal fatigue, and everything that was learned was revealed to the world. But it was too late for Britain's aircraft industry to recover lost ground. The lead was back with the enormous American aerospace industries, which, heavily funded by the military, produced the DC-8 and the Boeing 707. The 707 was in use over the Atlantic in 1958. Since then, 2,000 have been built and are still being used by carriers everywhere. This aircraft revolutionized post-war transport. Compared with propeller-driven aircraft, it carried twice as many passengers across the Atlantic almost twice as fast. Cruising at over 500 miles an hour, a typical version seated 180 tourist passengers. The age of flying like sardines had dawned. Airlines have long known that the faster you transport people, the tighter you can pack them. If a journey from London to New York takes 7 hours, one can tolerate crowding more easily than on a trip lasting 20 hours. The jet operators sold speed and low cost per mile, and in return provided only as much comfort as was felt to be absolutely necessary. On the 60-year journey towards the age of mass air travel, the next move was not so much a step as a mighty leap. And it happened in a now familiar manner. Boeing, Douglas and Lockheed were all competing for a military contract, a wide-bodied troop carrier. Lockheed won the contract. To use their designs, Douglas and Boeing took them to the airlines. The result was the jumbos, the DC-10 and the Boeing 747. At first, the airlines feared that this might be a huge aeroplane looking for passengers, and for a time they were flying a lot of empty seats around the world. But the jumbo's eventual success was inevitable. With its 490 seats, it had mass travel written into it from the start. The efficiency of this machine enabled the airlines to penetrate a totally new market. For better or for worse, it has democratized international travel. So much so that the rich now occupy a separate plane. Flying twice as high as a jumbo, over twice as fast, and at almost 10 times the cheapest fare, Concorde now carries the elite across the Atlantic in 3¼ hours, instead of the 16 that Alcock and Brown took. That wild and wasteful ocean is a barrier no longer, made to seem an obstacle no greater than the English Channel. There's no doubt where that coveted blue ribbon belongs today.
Clipper 101 Kennedy, now 123.7.
23.7, good day, Clipper 101, thank you.
Ciao.
Shortly, Flight 101 will be landing at New York.
Kennedy approach Clipper 101 at 10,000 for 8,000, 250 knots.
Clipper 101, turn left heading 250, descend and maintain 4,008 as Juliet is gone.
We have Juliet down to 4,000 and left to 250, Clipper 101.
Clipper 101, squawk 5524.
5524.
As we've seen, this high-capacity route across the Atlantic was the challenge that developed an extraordinary family of aircraft. But elsewhere, in the empty quarters of the globe, the same machines have worked a very different kind of magic. In the great land masses, the mountains and rivers and forests, are obstacles no less daunting than the oceans. Across the vast distances of South America, railways and roads are few and far between. Here, the big jets are still pioneering. To fly hour after hour over unbroken rainforest and rivers is just the beginning of understanding what air travel means to the people who live here. In Brazil, it all began in 1927, the same year that Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, when a Dornier seaplane flew from Rio de Janeiro to Porto Alegre in the south. That trip would have taken 7 days by boat, but the seaplane landed in the harbour here after only 2 days, including an overnight stop. It was the beginning of an airline that still bears the same name, Viação Aéreo Rio Grandense, now known worldwide as Varig. Although Varig now flies across the globe, its biggest task is still here in Brazil. Where distances are so great and where the people come from so many backgrounds, nation building has not been easy, as Brazil's turbulent history shows. But air travel has helped to tie together a fragmented nation, and new internal air routes are still being pioneered. Only in the age of the aeroplane could the planners have even considered shifting Brazil's capital from the coastal city of Rio de Janeiro to its present unlikely site. Brasilia lies on no natural lines of communication in the middle of a vast central plain. And without air communications, it simply couldn't function. And just as the railways opened up the far west of North America, the aeroplane has broken the isolation of the Amazon heartlands. You may remember travellers' tales about the lost city of Manaus decaying gently in the Amazon basin, 1,000 miles from the sea. It was an obscure settlement that flourished briefly and brilliantly with the rubber boom at the turn of the century. Its rubber millionaires spent much of their wealth on extravagant monuments to their own good fortune. An elaborate iron market was brought in from France. A customs house from England. Manaus became the first city in South America to install trams, telephones, and electricity. So wealthy were the rubber princes that it said they sent their laundry to Europe to be washed. But their most daring gesture was certainly to build the now famous opera house, the Teatro Amazonas. Many of the materials and decorations in this elegant building were laboriously shipped from Europe up the Amazon. It was a jewel of the Belle Epoque set in the jungle. Magnificent it must have been, while it lasted, which wasn't very long. Cheaper rubber very soon became available from much more accessible places, notably Malaya. The boom ended, and Manaus quickly declined into its former obscurity. The image I therefore had of the place was of romantic decay, of municipal splendor, giving way to the encroaching jungle. And that's for decades how it must have been. It's certainly how I hope to find it. But I came just a little bit too late. Manaus is booming again, restored by a development program in which aviation plays a leading part. A huge free trade zone has been created. The stores are stuffed with duty-free goods from around the world. Unlike other free ports, Manaus does not lie on a crossroads of international trade, and so industry was wooed in from outside. Factories with household names have sprouted from the jungle: Philco, Ford, Toshiba, Sanyo, Sharp, providing 40,000 jobs so far. This Honda factory air freights many of its components into the Amazon and turns out 180 motorbikes a day. The new international airport is thronged with duty-free shoppers. At last, the Amazon is no longer a forbidding, disease-ridden wilderness, but a magnet for visitors from all over Brazil and beyond. Manaus, that forbidding backwater, is now first port of call in Brazil for a new wave of tourists from North America and Europe. Manaus, the vulgar upstart city that once looked wistfully across the world to Paris and imitated its fashions and foibles, is now only a few hours distant from it on an Air France jumbo jet. Now, at one leap, tourists from Europe are transported to the heart of the Amazon, where Varig has built the largest hotel complex in South America, a 358-room tropical hotel, complete with sauna, disco, shops and swimming pool. By getting into the hotel business, Varig is following a worldwide trend. More and more, the airlines are providing the total tourist package, creating the market and then exploiting it. Varig's Amazon adventure holiday is about as venturesome as a choir boy outing. What started as that heroic race to conquer the Atlantic against seemingly impossible odds has become an almost mundane, everyday experience for the traveling masses. It's also become the foundation of a mighty economic force called international tourism. And that's where the aviation story stands today.
We'll be landing now in just over 1 minute's time.
Clipper 101, reduce your final approach speed, 1 company departure.
As Flight 101 makes its final approach to Kennedy Airport, New York, 400 more passengers prepare to disembark. 400 of the 17.5 million who now cross the Atlantic by air every year.
This side of the terminal. That's Lima Alpha.
Lima Alpha, roger.